In the freezing skies above Nazi-occupied Europe, the air war had become a brutal equation of flesh and steel. Every mission flown by Allied bomber crews meant hours of exposure to flak bursts, machine gun fire, and the bone-chilling cold of 25,000 feet. The odds were grim. By 1943, a bomber crewman in the U.S. 8th Air Force faced one of the deadliest survival rates in World War II, worse than that of ground infantry storming the beaches or fighting in the hedgerows. For every 100 airmen who took off from an English airfield, only about 26 would live to complete their tour of 25 missions. The men called it riding the coffin. They would climb aboard their flying fortresses, B-17s and B-24s, knowing that German fighters and flak guns waited for them beyond the Channel. The Luftwaffe's defenses were relentless. Steel fragments from anti-aircraft shells tore through fuselages, shredded oxygen tanks, and ripped into human bodies with devastating force. One well-placed burst could turn a crew compartment into a slaughterhouse in an instant. Yet amid this carnage, salvation came from an unexpected source, not a general, not an engineer, but a surgeon. His name was Dr. Wilbur Franks, a quiet, analytical man from Toronto whose curiosity about human endurance and injury would change the fate of thousands of airmen. Franks was not a soldier. He wasn't even officially part of the Bomber Command. He was a medical researcher at the University of Toronto, known more for his work on pilot physiology than for any connection to warfare. But it was his defiance of bureaucratic indifference, and his creation of a small, unauthorized innovation that would save more lives than many entire air campaigns. Before the steel vest, airmen wore nothing more than flight jackets or sheepskin suits to protect themselves. The aircraft skin itself offered little defense. The aluminum fuselage of a B-17 could be punctured by a single bullet. A flak fragment the size of a fingernail could pass through an airman's chest or thigh, and there was nothing to stop it. The surgeons at the forward hospitals saw the results daily: men with shattered ribs, torn arteries, and deadly internal bleeding caused not by direct hits, but by small shards of metal traveling at incredible speeds. Dr. Franks had spent years studying how the human body reacts to pressure and impact. He had originally gained fame for inventing the Franks suit, the world's first anti-G flight suit, designed to prevent pilots from blacking out under high-speed turns. But in 1942, while working with the Royal Canadian Air Force, he began to focus on another question: could the human body be shielded from flying shrapnel without sacrificing mobility or comfort? The official answer was no. Commanders dismissed the idea as impractical. Armor was heavy, restrictive, and considered useless against the large-caliber rounds used by German fighters. But Franks didn't see armor in terms of stopping bullets. He saw it as a means to reduce trauma, to catch fragments, deflect ricochets, and prevent secondary injuries caused by exploding shells. His idea was simple, even primitive by later standards: a flexible vest made from layers of woven steel plates, designed to absorb and disperse the energy of flak fragments. He called it the Flak Vest. At first, the concept drew ridicule. Pilots and aircrew joked that the extra weight would only make them sink faster if they were shot down over the Channel. The Air Ministry considered it an unnecessary burden, especially when bombers already struggled with fuel limits. But Franks refused to abandon the project. Working quietly in his Toronto lab, he collaborated with a small group of metallurgists and textile experts to produce a prototype. It consisted of interlocking manganese steel plates sewn between layers of heavy canvas, flexible enough to move with the body, yet dense enough to catch deadly fragments. By early 1943, Franks managed to secure limited approval for testing. The first sets were distributed, not to British crews, but to American airmen flying from England under the 8th Air Force. The results were immediate and astonishing. Reports began filtering in from debriefing officers, crews returning from missions over Bremen, Hamburg, and Schweinfurt with men wounded but alive because the flak vest had stopped a piece of steel that otherwise would have killed them. A waist gunner from the 91st Bomb Group survived a direct hit to the torso when a fragment struck the vest and lodged harmlessly in the outer layer. Another man, A navigator credited the vest for saving him after shrapnel that would have severed his femoral artery was stopped cold at his thigh. Word spread quickly. Crews who had once mocked the extra weight now refused to fly without their vests. They gave them nicknames: tin shirts, life jackets, or simply, Frank's armor. The medical statistics supported what the crews were saying. In bomber groups that adopted the vest, fatal flak injuries dropped dramatically. The number of men dying from abdominal and chest wounds was cut nearly in half. In the brutal arithmetic of air warfare, that was revolutionary. The irony, however, was that the vest was never officially authorized at first. Franks had gone around standard channels, bypassing military bureaucracy to get the vests made and shipped to operational units. In doing so, he violated multiple procurement and safety regulations. Had his experiment failed, or had one airman's death been blamed on the vest's added weight, his career would have ended in disgrace. But it didn't fail. Instead, it reshaped how air combat survival was understood. By mid-1944, production of the steel vest had expanded under official sanction. Factories in Britain and the United States began turning out thousands of sets per month. Each vest weighed about 16 pounds, light enough for aircrew to wear during long missions but strong enough to resist most shrapnel up to 20 mm shell fragments. The design was refined to include overlapping plates for the torso, groin flaps for seated gunners, and optional shoulder protectors. The psychological effect was as important as the physical protection. Crews felt safer, more confident, and more willing to fly missions that might otherwise have filled them with dread. One veteran later recalled, "It wasn't just armor, it was hope. We believed we had a fighting chance now." The surgeon who made it all possible rarely spoke about his contribution. Dr. Wilbur Franks didn't seek medals or publicity. He continued to work quietly in aviation medicine, shifting focus after the war to research in pilots' safety and acceleration tolerance. But those who flew with his invention never forgot him. In a war defined by industrial mass production and massive human loss, Frank's achievement was something different. It was personal, human, born not from orders or contracts but from compassion and defiance. It proved that innovation in wartime could come from anywhere, even from a single doctor's insistence that a life was worth saving, no matter the cost. By 1945, the flak vest had become standard issue for bomber crews in both the European and Pacific theaters. It would go on to serve in Korea and even early Vietnam, evolving into the modern ballistic vests worn by soldiers today. Its lineage could be traced directly back to that small, unauthorized experiment in a Toronto lab. The thousands of airmen who returned home safely because of that vest, men who otherwise might have perished in cold, thin air, owed their survival not to luck, not to armorers or strategists, but to a surgeon who believed that knowledge and empathy could be as powerful as any weapon. As Allied bombers pounded Germany's industrial heartlands in 1943, the skies became a killing ground. Every mission meant a calculated gamble: fuel, weather, enemy interceptors, and the merciless flak belts that stretched for miles around cities like Hamburg, Kiel, and Berlin. Crewmen watched entire formations disappear into black clouds of shrapnel. Inside those clouds, thousands of metal fragments screamed through the air at supersonic speed. A single piece could tear through the cockpit, sever a control line, or kill a man instantly. For the surgeons working at the frontline air evacuation hospitals, these fragments were their daily horror. Operating tables overflowed with wounded airmen, shattered limbs, punctured lungs, shredded intestines. Doctors struggled to save lives, but the injuries caused by flak were uniquely devastating. The metal wasn't just cutting flesh. It was carrying oil, dirt, and fabric deep into wounds, causing infection and death even when men made it back alive. The official military response was largely fatalistic. The doctrine of acceptable losses governed air warfare. Bombers were considered expendable, and so, by cruel extension, were their crews. The war machine demanded results, and safety innovations were often dismissed as distractions. That's what made Dr. Wilbur Franks so dangerous to the system. He wasn't supposed to innovate, certainly not without orders. He wasn't even a weapons designer or armorer. He was a physician who simply couldn't ignore what he saw: men dying from preventable wounds. Franks had spent his early career immersed in human physiology. Before the war, he was already known for designing a pressurized suit that helped pilots withstand extreme G-forces. His Franks suit was the direct ancestor of the anti-G flight suits still used by air forces today. But that invention had taken years of slow bureaucratic testing to gain approval. He had learned from that ordeal that official channels often killed good ideas faster than combat ever could. So when he began working on his flak vest, he did it quietly, almost in secret. He sourced the materials himself, recruited a small team of collaborators, and built prototypes with his own hands. The vests weren't produced in factories or military labs, but in small workshops across Toronto. He tested them using pig carcasses and sandbag mock-ups, firing fragments from artillery shells to simulate flak impacts. Again and again, the results were the same. The steel plates dispersed the energy, preventing penetration. The fragments embedded harmlessly between the layers instead of tearing through them. When Franks presented his data to military officials, the reaction was chilly. The Air Ministry's technical board dismissed the idea as impractical. "Armor is for tanks, not men," one senior officer reportedly told him. The notion of a surgeon designing armor struck them as absurd, even insubordinate. But Franks wasn't deterred. He knew the bureaucrats weren't the ones flying into enemy skies. The real judges, he decided, would be the airmen themselves. So he found a way to get his prototypes into the field through unofficial channels. By mid-1943, the first, unauthorized, shipments of flak vests began arriving at U.S. bomber bases in eastern England. They came without formal instruction or documentation, just labeled as experimental protective gear. Squadron surgeons and flight commanders, desperate for anything that might reduce casualties, began issuing them to crews on a voluntary basis. The results were impossible to ignore. Within weeks, medical officers reported a dramatic decrease in fatal torso wounds. Flak injuries were still brutal, but now more men were surviving them. Some were even walking off their aircraft with steel fragments embedded in their vests, silent proof that the armor had done its job. At the 8th Air Force's medical headquarters, statistics began to shift. Survival rates among airmen who wore the vest improved noticeably. For the first time, doctors could point to quantifiable evidence that a simple, low-cost innovation was saving hundreds of lives. That success spread by word of mouth faster than any memo could travel. Crews began trading, borrowing, and even stealing the vests from neighboring squadrons. A waist gunner from the 305th Bomb Group told a journalist after the war, "It wasn't regulation issue, but nobody cared. You didn't go up without one." And yet, despite its proven effectiveness, official recognition lagged behind. Commanders feared setting a precedent. If one, unauthorized, invention was tolerated, what would stop others from bypassing the system? But behind closed doors, senior officers began quietly authorizing expanded production. By 1944, the flak vest had become a quiet revolution. The British, initially skeptical, began producing their own versions, often using hardened manganese steel and improved shoulder protection. American manufacturers followed suit, developing lighter variants that could be mass-produced and distributed across the European and Pacific theaters. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time, bomber crews felt a sense of agency in a war that had previously treated them as statistics. Men who once climbed into their planes whispering last prayers now felt, if not safe, then at least protected. The vests didn't make them invincible, but they made them believe survival was possible. In debriefing interviews after missions, airmen credited the vest not just with saving lives, but with keeping morale intact. Pilots spoke of flying with renewed focus, knowing that if flak hit their formation, they might still make it home. One navigator said bluntly, "It didn't make the flak stop. It made us stop thinking about dying." That shift in mentality had measurable tactical results. Fewer wounded meant fewer replacements. Crews that survived together flew better, shot straighter, and completed missions more efficiently. Commanders noticed the difference. Still, Frank's quiet defiance didn't go unnoticed. Reports about his unapproved invention reached higher offices. Some officials argued that he had violated procurement laws and endangered military discipline. But by then, it was too late to suppress his work. The numbers spoke for themselves, casualty rates were falling, and morale was rising. When official approval finally came, it was more a formality than an endorsement. Franks never sought fame, and his name was often omitted from official documents. To the airmen, however, he was a hero. They nicknamed him Doc Armor. Stories about his invention spread through every airfield across England. The vest soon evolved. Early models were heavy and cumbersome, but subsequent designs used improved materials, tempered steel, lighter alloys, and even experimental woven fibers. Some versions included removable shoulder pads and groin protectors for gunners exposed in turret positions. Others were custom-tailored for pilots to fit beneath their parachute harnesses. By the end of 1944, nearly every bomber crew in the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces was equipped with the improved Type B3 flak vest. Production soared to thousands per month. The vest had gone from being a forbidden experiment to a standard piece of combat equipment, an indispensable element of bomber warfare. Dr. Franks himself received little public recognition. He continued his research quietly in Canada, contributing to post-war studies on pilot endurance and crash survivability. But his unauthorized creation had already left its mark. It's estimated that tens of thousands of airmen survived direct hits because of the vest. Their names never appeared in statistics as saved by armor. They were simply listed as returned from mission, wounded minor. But behind each of those dry reports was a story. A man who came home alive because one surgeon refused to accept that dying was inevitable. The steel vest wasn't glamorous. It didn't win battles, and it didn't appear in propaganda films. But in the silent ledger of human lives saved, it stands as one of the most consequential inventions of the air war. It began not in a factory, but in a hospital. In 1942, deep within the medical corridors of an English airbase, U.S. Army Air Forces Surgeon Major Malcolm Grove faced a grim pattern that no one else could ignore. Every day, the stretchers rolled in, bodies broken, uniforms shredded, and the same cold phrase repeated by medics. Chest wound. No chance. The Flying Fortress, the B-17 bomber, had earned its name for toughness. But even its legendary armor could not protect its crew from flak and machine gun fire that turned the sky over Europe into a furnace of metal. Grove, a quiet but relentless physician, began collecting data after every mission. He took notes, methodical, detached, like a scientist in a battlefield lab. Injury reports, casualty patterns, entry wounds, exit wounds. And what he found was horrifyingly consistent. 80% of all fatal wounds came from fragments hitting the chest or abdomen, areas lightly protected or completely exposed. Helmets shielded heads, jackets stopped the cold, but the torso, where life truly resided, was left defenseless. Grove's colleagues told him it was hopeless. "The boys are flying fortresses, not tanks," one officer said. "You can't armor a man like an airplane." But Grove didn't accept that. He wasn't looking for invincibility, only a margin of survival. He began experimenting, quietly, unofficially. Using discarded materials from aircraft repair depots, he tested sheets of manganese steel and nylon fabric, layering them over woolen flight suits. The goal: stop shrapnel without grounding the men under unbearable weight. At first, the aircrews laughed. The idea of wearing a steel vest seemed absurd, like medieval armor in the age of high-altitude warfare. "What's next, Doc?" they joked. "A suit of chainmail?" But the laughter stopped after Grove's prototypes began saving lives. One of the first real tests came during a bombing raid over Germany in early 1943. A B-17 crew from the 305th Bomb Group returned with 2 engines dead and the fuselage torn apart. Inside, the radio operator, who had been wearing Grove's early vest, was still alive. A piece of flak the size of a coin had struck directly over his heart. The steel plate inside his vest bore a deep dent, but it had stopped the fragment cold. Grow logged the case and presented it to his commanding officer. "The difference between this man being dead and alive," he said, "is 2 pounds of steel." That line traveled fast, up the chain of command and across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1943, the Air Force authorized full-scale testing. Grow worked with British manufacturers to refine the design. The result was a flak jacket, a vest made of interlocking manganese steel plates sewn into canvas pockets, tailored for gunners, bombardiers, and navigators. Each vest weighed about 22 pounds, but the effect was immediate. Within weeks of deployment, casualty reports began to shift. The number of fatal torso wounds among bomber crews dropped by nearly 60%. For the first time, a B-17 gunner could face the swarm of German 88mm guns with a fighting chance. But the journey to official adoption was anything but smooth. At first, military bureaucracy resisted. Commanders argued it would fatigue airmen, interfere with movement, or reduce flight efficiency. Others scoffed that it wasn't regulation issue. Grow ignored them. He pushed forward, producing vests through informal channels, distributing them through medical units instead of ordnance depots, an act technically unauthorized under Army rules. To Grow, it wasn't disobedience. It was duty. As he put it, "If I can give a man one more chance to come home, I don't need a signature to do it." His defiance paid off. Reports from units using the vest were so overwhelming that resistance evaporated. By late 1943, every bomber crew flying out of England was issued one. The results spoke louder than any order. In the skies over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin, the names etched into the history of daylight bombing, gunners began returning with stories that bordered on miraculous. A tail gunner from the 100th Bomb Group, nicknamed the Bloody 100th, was hit square in the chest by flak. The force knocked him backward, the vest plate shattered, but when medics reached him, he was breathing. He lived to fly again. Another crewman described the sound of a fragment striking his vest. "Like a hammer on a bell. Without it," he said, "I'd be in the North Sea by now." Every story added another layer of proof. Grow's steel vest, once ridiculed, had become as vital as the oxygen mask. By 1944, his design inspired further innovation. Engineers refined the material, replacing steel with ballistic nylon, which offered flexibility and lighter weight. This evolution marked the birth of modern body armor, a technology that would later protect soldiers, police, and even astronauts. The same principle that saved bomber crews over Europe would, decades later, save infantrymen in Vietnam and journalists in war zones. When General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, reviewed gross data, he was stunned. "Malcolm," he said, "you've done more for the survival of our airmen than any weapon in this war." For his relentless innovation and refusal to accept bureaucratic defeat, Grow was awarded the Legion of Merit in 1944. But even honors could not capture the true scale of what he'd accomplished. Behind every medal was a father who came home, a letter that didn't need to begin with, "We regret to inform you." After the war, Grow continued his work in aviation medicine, shaping the field of aerospace physiology and safety systems. The man who began as a battlefield surgeon would end his career as the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Air Force, guiding the development of protective gear for the jet age. And yet, when asked years later what he was proudest of, Grow didn't mention his title or his rank. He simply pointed to a faded vest hanging in his study, dented, scarred, and still carrying a trace of the olive-drab fabric of a B-17 crewman's jacket. "This," he said softly, "wasn't about armor. It was about hope." The story of Major Malcolm Gross, Unauthorized, steel vest is not just a tale of medical ingenuity. It's a reminder of what happens when compassion meets courage. In a war defined by destruction, one man's determination to protect life became an act of quiet rebellion, and a legacy that endures in every piece of body armor worn today. The same principle that saved bomber crews over Europe would, decades later, save infantrymen in Vietnam and journalists in war zones. When General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, reviewed gross data, he was stunned. "Malcolm," he said, "you've done more for the survival of our airmen than any weapon in this war." For his relentless innovation and refusal to accept bureaucratic defeat, Grow was awarded the Legion of Merit in 1944. But even honors could not capture the true scale of what he'd accomplished. Behind every medal was a father who came home, a letter that didn't need to begin with, "We regret to inform you." After the war, Grow continued his work in aviation medicine, shaping the field of aerospace physiology and safety systems. The man who began as a battlefield surgeon would end his career as the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Air Force, guiding the development of protective gear for the jet age. And yet, when asked years later what he was proudest of, Grow didn't mention his title or his rank. He simply pointed to a faded vest hanging in his study, dented, scarred, and still carrying a trace of the olive-drab fabric of a B-17 crewman's jacket. "This," he said softly, "wasn't about armor. It was about hope." The story of Major Malcolm Gross, Unauthorized, Steel Vest is not just a tale of medical ingenuity. It's a reminder of what happens when compassion meets courage. In a war defined by destruction, one man's determination to protect life became an act of quiet rebellion, and a legacy that endures in every piece of body armor worn today. It is proof that sometimes, the most powerful weapon in war isn't built to kill, but to save. The miracle of Major Malcolm Gross' steel vest began spreading across England's airfields like a whispered prayer. From Thorpe Abbotts to Bassingbourn, bomber crews now spoke of the Grow jacket, in the same reverent tone they once reserved for Lucky Charms. A flight engineer might touch the edge of his vest before boarding the B-17, murmuring, "Here's to Doc Grow." Each returning plane carried not only men but proof, physical evidence of survival. Flak fragments embedded in the vest plates, deep grooves gouged by shrapnel, even bullet marks that had failed to penetrate. Grow's office became an impromptu museum of near-death. Each vest told a story, each dent a heartbeat preserved. He began cataloging them, taking photographs, recording the details. "This man lived," he'd write beneath a mangled piece of metal, "because of this." But behind the growing legend, the air war was entering its darkest phase. By late 1943, American bombers were striking deep into Germany's industrial heart: Hamburg, Bremen, the Ruhr Valley. Loss rates soared. Entire squadrons vanished. On one mission to Schweinfurt, 60 bombers never returned. Nearly 600 men were gone in a single day. The survivors, however, told a consistent story. Those who had worn Gross armor were coming back more often, even when their planes didn't. Commanders finally began to take notice. At 8 Bomber Command headquarters, senior officers convened an emergency review of crew protection. Gross research was placed front and center. His field data showed not only reduced fatalities but a measurable psychological effect. Crews felt more secure, more willing to face the enemy sky again. That morale boost, invisible but real, was a weapon in itself. Grow was summoned to London to brief General Spaatz and Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the head of Britain's Bomber Command. The British had been developing their own protective suits, but none had achieved Grow's balance of strength and wearability. In the smoky meeting room, Grow placed one of his vests on the table, scarred, pitted, and still smelling faintly of gun oil. "This vest," he said, "has already stopped 3 pieces of flak. Its owner is alive and well in Cambridge." Harris, ever skeptical of new gadgets, leaned forward and lifted the vest. "Heavy," he muttered. Grow nodded. "Yes, sir. But not as heavy as a coffin." The room went silent. By the end of the meeting, both the American and British commands had agreed. Every bomber crewman flying over Europe would wear one. Production ramped up with astonishing speed. British textile factories in Birmingham and Leeds converted entire lines to produce Gross design, while American manufacturers began shipping specialized steel inserts. The vests were issued first to gunners, those most exposed in the tail and waist positions, then to navigators and bombardiers. Each vest bore a small white tag. Flak Protective Vest Type M3. Approved by USAF Medical Corps. But among the men, they simply called it gross armor. Letters from crewmen began to pour in. One, from Staff Sergeant William, read O'Hara read, "Doc, that vest you gave me, it's ugly, heavy, and I curse it every time I climb the ladder to the tail gun. But last week, over Hanover, it caught a piece of flak the size of my thumb. It knocked the wind out of me. I thought I was hit. When I checked later, the plate had a hole. My chest didn't. You saved me, document. You saved me." Grow kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his life. In the months that followed, as the Allied bombing campaign intensified, the steel vest became part of the identity of the American airman. Photographs from the period show crews lined up beside their flying fortresses, vests bulging under flight jackets, the weight distributed by wide shoulder straps. The look was unmistakable, a blend of soldier and machine, flesh and armor. Even the Luftwaffe began to notice. Captured German reports referred to the new American armored jackets and described gunners as remarkably resistant to fragmentary injury. But Gross' work didn't stop there. He began studying burns, oxygen deprivation, and the effects of cold on high-altitude physiology. His belief was simple: the best weapon was a living man. One of his most remarkable contributions came in early 1944, when he collaborated with Flight Surgeon Lieutenant Colonel Harry Armstrong, another pioneer in aviation medicine. Together, they developed a layered protection system: oxygen mask, heated suit, flak vest, and crash harness, the blueprint for modern aircrew safety gear. They tested everything themselves, climbing into unpressurized aircraft, enduring bitter cold at 25,000 feet, sometimes returning with frostbite on their fingers. Grow often said, "If we won't wear it, either will they." His hands, once delicate instruments of surgery, became rough and scarred from fieldwork. Yet his eyes, calm, analytical, missed nothing. As D-Day approached, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched some of its most punishing missions yet. Crews flying over Normandy, Caen, and St. Lo carried not just bombs, but Gross' invisible shield, his act of defiance against mortality. Historians would later calculate that his vests reduced fatal wounds by nearly 400 deaths per 1,000 missions. That meant thousands of sons, brothers, and fathers who came home. When Grow returned to the United States in 1945, he brought with him a collection of battered vests, photographs, and testimonials, a record of humanity's refusal to surrender to the machinery of war. He was promoted to brigadier general and, soon after, became the first surgeon general of the U.S. Air Force. But to those who had flown with his invention, he remained simply Doc Grow, the man who gave us a chance. In the decades that followed, his creation evolved. The crude steel plates became Kevlar, Spectra, and Dyneema, synthetic fibers capable of stopping bullets lighter than a paperback book. Yet the principle never changed. Every life saved justified every risk taken. In Vietnam, aircrews wore flak vests nearly identical in concept to Gross. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers and medics alike carried his legacy on their shoulders. Even today, modern body armor still traces its lineage to that unauthorized experiment in an English hangar. When Malcolm Grow died in 1960, he left behind not just a line of medical innovations, but a philosophy: that protection is as noble as attack, that science serves humanity best when it refuses to wait for permission. At his funeral, one of the airmen whose life he had saved decades earlier sent a note. It read, "Because of you, I lived long enough to have grandchildren. They'll never know your name, but they live in the world you helped create." And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of all: not a medal, not a title, but the silent continuation of life. In the vast sweep of World War II, amid the grand strategies and monumental battles, the story of Malcolm Grow might seem small: one man, one idea, a few pounds of steel. But in the endless ledger of war, where death is measured by numbers and distance, a single saved life changes everything. Grow proved that courage doesn't always mean flying the plane or firing the gun. Sometimes it means standing in the shadows, quietly bending the rules, and daring to protect. His invention did not win the war. But for thousands of men, it won them back their tomorrows.